The United States Constitution places significant structural limits on the power of legislative bodies, particularly concerning laws that attempt to reach backward in time. We are focusing today on retroactive legislation, laws that change the legal consequences of actions that have already occurred, often unfairly burdening individuals or established rights. This chapter introduces the two primary constitutional mechanisms designed to prevent such unfair retroactivity: the Contracts Clause and the Ex Post Facto Clause. Visually, imagine these as two distinct shields protecting citizens from legislative overreach. While both clauses restrict the government from applying new rules to past events, they operate in entirely different spheres. The Contracts Clause primarily governs civil obligations and commercial stability, whereas the Ex Post Facto Clause provides an absolute bar against retroactive criminal penalties. Over the next segments, we will conduct a deep dive into both of these critical Article 1 restrictions to understand precisely how they limit legislative authority. We begin our detailed examination with the first shield, the Contracts Clause, found in Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1 of the Constitution. This clause explicitly states that no state shall pass any law impairing the obligation of contracts. Notice immediately that this restriction is directed solely at the states. It does not apply to the federal government. Historically, this provision arose directly from the chaos following the Revolutionary War. States frequently passed laws attempting to discharge debts owed to creditors, often foreign merchants, through inflationary currency or outright repudiation. The goal of the Contracts Clause was to restore commercial confidence and stability by ensuring that private agreements, once made, would be honored. Therefore, when analyzing this clause, we are looking for state action that directly interferes with the enforcement or validity of existing contractual duties. The key phrase we must remember, which defines the scope of this protection, is impairing the obligation of contracts. Now that we understand the core prohibition against impairing contracts, we must examine the modern judicial framework for analyzing such claims. Following key Supreme Court decisions, notably United States Trust Company v. New Jersey and Allied Structural Steel Company v. Spencer, courts employ a highly deferential two-part test. This test acknowledges that states retain some power to legislate for the public welfare, even if it incidentally affects contracts. Step 1 requires the challenger to demonstrate that the state law has substantially impaired a contractual relationship. Mere technical interference is insufficient. The impairment must be significant. If substantial impairment is established, the analysis proceeds to Step 2. Here, the burden shifts to the state to prove two things. First, that the law serves a significant and legitimate public purpose. Second, the court must find that the adjustment made by the legislation is both reasonable and necessary to achieve that stated public purpose. If the state fails either prong of Step 2, the law violates the Contracts Clause. This entire process is best visualized as a decision tree. While that two-part test seems comprehensive, the Contracts Clause is not an absolute bar against retroactive state action. The primary limitation arises from the state's inherent police power. When a state legislates to protect public health, safety, or morals, courts grant significant deference, even if the regulation substantially impairs private contracts. However, this police power is not absolute. The level of scrutiny applied heavily depends on the nature of the contract involved. Public contracts, such as state bond agreements, are treated differently than private agreements. These public obligations receive much higher judicial scrutiny because they implicate the state's fiscal stability. For instance, a retroactive zoning change affecting a private property contract might be upheld under police power. Conversely, A retroactive tax increase specifically targeting existing bondholders faces a much steeper hurdle to satisfy the reasonable and necessary requirement of Step 2. We have spent considerable time analyzing the Contracts Clause, which primarily safeguards vested civil rights and contractual expectations against retroactive state interference. Now, we pivot from the civil realm to the criminal realm, where the Constitution imposes an even more stringent prohibition against retroactive legislation, the ex post facto clause. This clause ensures fundamental fairness and due process by preventing the government from punishing conduct that was legal when performed. Unlike the Contracts Clause, which involves balancing tests, the ex post facto prohibition is nearly absolute when applied to criminal law. To understand its scope, we must look directly at the text. Article 1 of the Constitution explicitly forbids this practice. Specifically, Section 9 prohibits the federal Congress from passing any ex post facto law, while Section 10 extends the same prohibition to the individual states. These provisions serve as a bedrock principle against arbitrary governmental action. Having established the constitutional text prohibiting ex post facto laws, we must now define precisely what constitutes such a law. The Supreme Court provided this essential framework in the landmark 1798 case, Calder v. Bull. This decision remains the cornerstone for analyzing any claim under the ex post facto clause. Crucially, the court made clear that this clause applies only when the legislation is penal or criminal in nature. It does not reach retroactive civil laws, which are governed by other constitutional provisions. Justice Chase, writing for the court, articulated 4 specific types of laws that fall under this absolute prohibition. These 4 categories define the scope of unconstitutional retroactivity in criminal law. We will detail each of these 4 prohibitions in our next segment, but for now, let us visualize the framework established by Calder v. Bull. Let us now examine Justice Chase's 4 specific prohibitions in detail. First, Category 1 prohibits any law that criminalizes an act that was entirely innocent when it was committed. This is the most fundamental application of the clause. Imagine performing an action legally one day, and a new law makes that past action a crime. That is unconstitutional retroactivity. Second, Category 2 forbids laws that aggravate a crime, making it greater in its nature than it was when committed. For instance, elevating a misdemeanor to a felony retroactively falls here. Third, Category 3 prevents increasing the punishment prescribed for a crime after the offense occurred. If the maximum sentence was 5 years, a new law cannot retroactively impose 10 years for that same past act. Finally, Category 4 addresses procedural changes. This prohibits altering the rules of evidence to permit a conviction based upon less or different testimony than what the law required at the time of the offense, provided this change is detrimental to the defendant. These 4 categories provide the complete scope of the ex post facto prohibition. We have just established that the ex post facto clause provides an absolute shield against retroactive criminal laws. However, the Constitution treats retroactive civil legislation quite differently. Generally speaking, the government is permitted to pass laws that apply retroactively to civil matters. Consider changes to tax rates or altering the statute of limitations for civil lawsuits. These are often upheld because the law is not penal. Nevertheless, retroactive civil laws are not entirely unchecked. They remain subject to scrutiny under other constitutional provisions. Specifically, they must not violate the Contracts Clause, the Due Process Clause, or the Takings Clause. This leads us to the crucial distinction we must internalize for the bar examination. While ex post facto laws face strict prohibition because they are criminal, retroactive civil laws are generally permissible unless they infringe upon those other specific constitutional guarantees. We have now seen the distinct constitutional treatments for retroactive legislation. The ex post facto clause offers an absolute shield against retrospective criminal punishment, rooted in fundamental fairness. Conversely, the contracts clause provides protection for commercial stability, but it requires a balancing act. For the uniform bar examination, remember this crucial synthesis. When analyzing the contracts clause, the court must weigh the significant public need against the impairment of private contractual obligations. If the law is civil, the analysis stops there unless due process or takings are implicated. However, if the law touches criminal liability in any way, the ex post facto clause acts as an immediate and absolute veto against retroactivity. Ultimately, both clauses serve the overarching constitutional goal of ensuring predictability in commercial dealings and predictability in criminal liability. This final graphic summarizes where each shield applies.